Chapter 20. When Brenda Wyatt had left the shop, MacLeod went back into his room and began working on the invoices she had interrupted. He still had a business to run. At lunchtime, he went up to his apartment. A stranger walking into the rooms might think that MacLeod had no divisions between his private life and his professional hours. The room, at first glance, into which he walked, was circular, with many bookshelves and what might be regarded by others as antiques lining the walls. They were in fact all personal mementos from various times in his own history. In a rosewood box on the coffee table was the only piece of jewellery that Heather had owned. A pendant, a Celtic bronze cross set with uncut garnets. MacLeod had made it himself, fishing the garnets from a burn on the slopes of Ben Law, where they were as plentiful as pebbles, and had worked the bronze at the forge. Heather had adored that cross and made him promise to keep it rather than bury it with her. He went into the kitchen and made himself a cup of coffee. There had been a time when he had been unfaithful to Heather, in the sense that he rarely thought of her, and when he did, he dismissed that thought from his mind, because it was painful to look back on. But just lately he had slipped back into his old dreams, those he used to have when Heather had recently died. Now why was that? He went to the rosewood box, and, with the coffee in one hand, took out the pendant and studied it. How crude the workmanship looked now. Yet, as he held it in his hand, the past came flooding back to him. He could recall the smell of the Highlands. There was nothing else like it. And the rough weave of the texture of Heather's tartan as she leaned against him in the doorway to the croft. They used to stand there together and stare out at the mountains, telling each other how lucky they were to have been born in the Highlands. He could recall the smell of wood smoke in her hair and the scent of womanhood about her after he had lifted her coarse kilt and made love to her in some hollow in the glen. He sighed. It was all romantic rubbish, he supposed. Perhaps he had forgotten the harsh winters and the times they had gone hungry and the infernal lice problem. Things like that tended to get pushed to the back of the mind centuries later, in a comfortable apartment in New York City. He replaced the pendant. Suddenly, he knew why he had been reminded of Heather, and he felt guilty that the dreams had needed a trigger. It was because of that woman, Brenda Wyatt. There were certain physical resemblances between her and his Heather. The colour of the hair, the shape of the face. Memory was a funny thing, though. He could recall things that happened in his first 50 years on Earth with far more clarity than many more recent events. With the exception of one. The day on which he had found Rachel. It had been in World War II, in a bombed-out factory in Germany, the heart of the Rhineland. He had wandered into the ruins and found this little bundle of rags, inside which slept a small girl, amongst the broken glass and smashed crates that were scattered over the floor. She had been frightened of him at first. When he woke her, she edged away from him with wide eyes. He must have looked pretty rough, unshaven and battle-grimed. They had been pushing units of the SS back for days, and the die-hard Nazis had been harder to winkle out than rats from holes. "Shh," he had said, trying to calm her. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." But of course, she did not speak or understand English, and it was only the tone of his voice that reassured her. Or so she told him much later. "What's your name?" he had asked her. "Namen. Wie heißen Sie?" "Rachel." He had searched his mind for his meagre German. Wo deine Mutti? Mama? Tot, alle. Gently he said, I'm like you. I'm alone. He bent to pick her up. At that moment, a German officer in the uniform of the SS stepped through a doorway and raised a submachine gun. Without any hesitation or regard for the little girl, he pointed the weapon towards them and squeezed the trigger. Luckily for Rachel, he had aimed high, and an arc of bullets swept across the spot where MacLeod stood. 3 of them hitting him full in the chest. He sank to the ground with a sigh. The German ran forward and stood over him, looking down. He kicked MacLeod in the ribs, and as he did so, the American grabbed his boot and threw him off balance. The gun dropped from his grasp, and MacLeod picked it up. The officer was looking at him with astonishment. "Get up," he said. The man climbed to his feet and brushed down his uniform. He looked as tired and beaten as MacLeod felt, but there was still arrogance and contempt in his eyes. "Move," said MacLeod, flicking the gun. The officer stood his ground. Perhaps he had had enough. When the dead start climbing to their feet, you begin to wonder what kind of enemy you are fighting, and how the devil you can win against black magic. "Nein!" The officer began to stride off in the opposite direction, unconcerned about the fact that he was being covered by his own weapon. "Whatever you say," sighed MacLeod. "You're the master race." He pulled the trigger, and the officer spun on his heels and fell to the floor, bleeding from several wounds. He lay still. Rachel looked at the body, as if she expected that at any moment it would get to its feet, the way MacLeod had done, and the whole thing would be reenacted in reverse again. She told MacLeod later that she thought it was magic. When he thought she was ready, long after he had adopted her, he told her who and what he was. She said, "I was right. It was magic." MacLeod had raised Rachel as his own daughter, finding a new interest in his jaded life, in parenthood. Now she looked almost twice his age. He had told her all about Heather, and for once it was good. It felt good to talk to someone about the past, someone whom he could trust completely. It was like having a Heather to live with again, without the future pain of losing a wife and a lover. Of course, he would be very sad when Rachel died, but it would not be the same as having his heart torn out of his chest. It would be a gentler parting, he thought. There was a knock on the door of the apartment. He went to it and looked through the spy hole. It was Rachel. "I just called by to see if you needed anything." "No, I'm all stocked up. Do you want to stay for a drink?" "Okay, thanks." She entered and kissed him on the cheek. "You're looking tired." "You know why." "Does it have to be this way? The gathering?" "I don't know any way of stopping it." He went to the drinks cabinet and poured them both a scotch. When he turned, she was staring at him in a peculiar way. "What are you looking at, Rachel?" "The eyes in the back of your head." He nodded. "Funny." She said, "People are asking about you." "Yes." "What am I supposed to say?" He said wryly, "Tell them I'm immortal. Tell them how you saw me die, then stand up on my feet and walk away." That was a long time ago. For you, maybe. The Boston Tea Party, now that was a long time ago, to me." She seemed to be getting impatient with him. "Would you listen to me for 1 minute, please?" She sat down in a chair, the light shining on her long black locks and in her dark eyes. She said, "You can't hide your feelings from me. I've known you too long." "What feelings?" he mumbled quietly. He did not want to hear what she had to say. He felt he knew what was coming. "How about loneliness?" "I'm not lonely. I've got you. I've got everything I need right here." "That's not true. You don't have everything you need. I can see it in you quite plainly. You refuse to let anyone love you." He smiled. "Don't you love me, Rachel?" "Not that way. Romantic love is for poets." He stroked her cheek. "You're such a romantic, Rachel." She smiled. "You always were," he said.